Here with Mike, new talk about writing.
Hi folks, today we're going to talk about how long a story should be. A lot of beginning writers who want to be novelists or short story writers, they start out and they say, well, how long does a story have to be? And the answer is that a story has to be as long as it's necessary to tell the story. Well, how long is that? Can you aim for certain lengths? What's the sweet target? It depends on what you're trying to write. If we're talking about novels, 60,000 words is considered a small novel. That's not a big deal. I have friends who write 5,000 words a day before noon, come hell or high water. That means if they do it for 12 days, they've got 60,000 words. It's discipline which produces all those words. How long should a short story be? Same answer. As long as it takes to get the point across. The difference between a short story and a novel is that a short story is about only one thing. A number of short stories come to mind, like August Heat, which is a favorite horror short story. I recommend it, about how the heat affects a man wandering through his town during the height of August when he comes across a tombstone maker and finds his own name on the tombstone. There are so many great stories like that, and there are a lot of markets for short stories. If you want to be a professional writer, don't try to do the Olympic jump first time out of the gate. Write short stories. They take less time to write. You can write a bunch of them, and there's a huge market for them. Just go online and look for online magazines searching for short stories, and you'll find more than you can possibly handle. One of my favorites is published by an old friend of mine in Wisconsin. It's called Rosebud, and they take all kinds of short stories. You might want to check that out. When it comes to a novel, people have good ideas, and then they start out, but they often peter out halfway through because they are not experienced and they have not yet come to understand what constitutes story. Once you understand what constitutes story, you don't make a wrong turn and you don't worry about length. Well, what constitutes story? That's the answer to that is a little puzzling, but you'll know it when you got it. There's so many things that go into a novel. The narrative voice, a fascinating character, a fascinating situation, and also specialty knowledge. If you can talk about a scene which does not necessarily advance the plot, but entertains the reader and does not deviate from the plot, that's part of the story. I remember reading a novel many years ago. I can't recall the name, but it involved one of the major characters going into a restaurant and ordering a huge meal. He ordered the salad, the blood pudding, the filet, the noodles, a side dish of steamed vegetables. Then he ate it all. Then he called the waiter over and he said, "Let's do it all again." And that stuck with me all these years because it's memorable and it was funny. It didn't really advance the plot because it was part of the story. It was part of the story because it was what that character would do, and it gives us insight into that character. When I first started writing novels, I had no idea what I was doing. I would just sit down and wing it. I have since concluded that's not a good plan. And now I outline everything before I write it, including graphic novels. There are only a handful of writers who can sit down and wing it without setting out a direction for themselves ahead of time. Peter Branville, the Western writer, is one of them. But Westerns have a certain path that they follow for the most part. And when you write a Western, you're never at a loss for what happens next because we've absorbed the legend of the West, so many of us, from reading novels and watching the movies, that we know what's going to happen next. There are going to be encounters, there might be a shootout, there might be a revenge story mixed in, there might be a survival story mixed in, but the West keeps throwing ideas at you so that you're never out of them. When it comes to other novels, I advise you to outline. Most commercial novels are in the 80 to 90,000 word range. I just finished a novel by Larry Correia called Gunrunner. It was 150,000 words. I'm going to be turning that into 2 graphic novels of 90 pages each. It's an enormous undertaking. But when it comes to length, the king of the long-winded novelists is James Michener, who's written so many memorable books. His longest book is Texas, which is 400,000 words long. About 10 years ago, I began reading his novel Centennial, which is about Colorado. In fact, it's placed where I live. It's placed right around here, and Greeley features prominently as the town of Centennial. I read, it begins with the dinosaurs. That's what Michener does. He begins in a prehistoric time and then takes us up through everything. And by the time I got through the settling of the West, the novel took a blander turn for me, and I wasn't that interested, so I set it down. I have not yet finished it. But when people say, what are you reading? I always answer, James Michener's Centennial, day 3,415. Centennial is 232,000 words. I recently picked this up because it's so emblematic of what we're talking about. This has got to be at least 250,000 words. I will get to it one of these days. So that's my advice. Start out with a short story. You can write the premise out in 1 or 2 sentences. Finish it. Submit it. If they send it back, keep submitting it. There's no greater confidence builder than selling your first short story. When it comes to novels, outline. Interest yourself. I always say a writer has to entertain himself before he can entertain readers. So keep that in mind. When you're writing, do you find what you write entertaining? And that's not the same as do you find what you're writing good, because a lot of people kid themselves into thinking what they just wrote is good because they wrote it. But that's not the final arbiter. You have to write for a long time before you understand what constitutes story. I've mentioned this before, but there's a great English novelist named John Braine, whose most famous book was Room at the Top. And he wrote a book about writing, of which there are many. And he wrote that it's called Writing Your Novel. And in it he says, no one should attempt to write a novel before they're 40 years old because they simply don't have enough worldly experience to be able to describe the world from all points of view. And it's the novelist's job to imagine every point of view presented in his novel. That's it. Get writing.
Thank you.